I have completed John Rogers, Sealed with Blood, and also Emotional Victory. So I need to pick up and not pick up, but start, I guess you should say, a couple more books. This one is Awful Disclosures, A Nun's Life in a Convent Exposed. I have not read it, just like all the other books. I read it for the first time with you all. So I do not know what this is going to entail, but it will probably be heartbreaking on top of the fact that you may not want little children in the room. That's what I'm thinking. I don't know. Like I said, I've never read it. I didn't even skim it. So that's all I can say on that. Another book that I may be starting, and I think I am going to. Now, this one isn't going to be a long one, but it's called Can It Happen Again? Chronicles of the Holocaust. It was written, originally published in 1978. And like I said, I've not read it. I do not know what it's going to say. So, and if I come across something that I find is completely heretical or whatever, I will stop reading it like I have other books, just plain and simple. So anyway, this is the preface to Awful Disclosures, A Nun's Life in a Convent Exposed by Maria Monk. This would have been written in, well, I think the 1800s or something. I'm not exactly sure. So we'll see. Preface to the first edition. This volume embraces not only my awful disclosures, but a continuation of my narrative, given an account of events after my escape from the nunnery and of my return to Montreal to procure a legal investigation of my charges. It also, illegible, it says in parentheses, it's illegible, so they don't know what she had written there. All the testimony that has been published against me or every description, as well as that which has been given in confirmation of my story. At the close will be found a review of the whole subject, furnished by a gentleman well qualified for the purpose. And finally, a copious appendix giving further particulars interesting to the public. I present this volume to the reader with feelings which, I trust, will be in some degree appreciated when it has been read and reflected upon. A hasty perusal and an imperfect apprehension of its contents can never produce such impressions as it has been my design to make by the statements I have laid before the world. I know that misapprehensions exist in the mind of some virtuous people. I am not disposed to condemn their motives, for it does not seem wonderful that in a pure state of society and in the midst of Christian families there should be persons who regard the crimes I have mentioned as too monstrous to be believed. It certainly is credible to American manners and character that the people are inclined at first sight to turn from my story with horror. There is also an excuse for those who, having received only a general impression concerning the nature of my disclosures, question the propriety of publishing such immorality to the world. They fear that the minds of the young, at least, may be polluted. To such I have to say that this objection was examined and set aside long before they had an opportunity to make it. I solemnly believe it is necessary to inform parents, at least, that the ruin from which I have barely escaped lies in the way of their children, even if delicacy must be in some degree wounded by revealing the fact. I understand the case, alas, from too bitter experience. Many an innocent girl may this year be exposed to the dangers of which I was ignorant. I am resolved that so far as depends on me, not one more victim shall fall into the hands of those enemies in whose power I so lately have been. I know what it is to be under the dominion of nuns and priests, and I maintain that it is a far greater offense against virtue and decency to conceal than to proclaim their crimes. Ah, had a single warning voice even whispered to me a word of caution, Had even a gentle note of alarm been sounded to me, it might have turned back my foot from the convent when it was upon the threshold. If, therefore, there is any one now bending a step that way, whom I have not yet alarmed, I will cry, beware. But the virtuous reader need not fear in the following pages to meet with vice presented in any dress but her own deformity. No one can accuse me of giving a single attraction to crime. On the contrary, I intend my book shall be a warning to those who may hereafter be tempted by vice, and with the confidence that such it will prove to be, I commend it to the careful examination of virtuous parents, and am willing to abide by their unbiased opinion with regard both to my truth, my motives, and the interest which the public have in the developments it contains. I would now appeal to the world and ask whether I have not done all that could have been expected of me and all that lay in my power to bring to an investigation the charges I have brought against the priests and nuns of Canada. Although it was necessary to the cause of truth that I should, in some degree, implicate myself, I have not hesitated to appear as a voluntary self-accuser before the world. While there was a hope that the authorities in Canada might be prevailed upon to bring the subject to a legal investigation, I traveled to Montreal in a feeble state of health and with an infant in my arms, only 3 weeks old. In the face of many threats and dangers, I spent nearly a month in that city in vain attempts to bring my cause to a trial. When all prospects of success in this undertaking had disappeared, and not till then, I determined to make my accusations through the press. And although misrepresentations, scandals, flattery, and threats have been resorted to nullify or to suppress my testimony, I have persevered, although, as many of my friends have thought, at the risk of abduction or death. I have, I think, afforded every opportunity that could be reasonably expected to judge of my credibility. I have appealed to the existence of things in the Hôtel du Nunnery as the great criterion of the truth of my story. I have described the apartments and now in this volume have added many further particulars with such a description of them as my memory has enabled me to make. I have offered, in case I should be proved an impostor, to submit to any punishment which may be proposed, even to a redelivery into the hands of my bitterest enemies, to suffer what they may please to inflict. Now, in these circumstances, I would ask the people of the United States whether my duty has not been discharged. Have I not done what I ought to inform and to alarm them? I would also solemnly appeal to the government of Great Britain, under whose guardianship is the province oppressed by the gloomy institution from which I have escaped, and ask whether such atrocities ought to be tolerated and even protected by an enlightened and Christian power. I trust the hour is near when the dens of the Hôtel Dieu will be laid open, when the tyrants who have polluted it will be brought out with the wretched victims of their oppression and crimes. And then now that was the preface for her first edition. Right here is the preface for this one. Here is the reprint of one of the most formidable books against nunneries ever published. It was produced powerful impressions abroad as well as in the United States and appears destined to have still greater results. It is the simple narrative of an uneducated and unprotected female who escaped from the old black nunnery of Montreal, or Hôtel Dieu, and told her tale of sufferings and horror without exaggeration or embellishment. Though assailed by all the powers of the Romish priesthood, whom she accused, and by the united influence of the North American press, which, with very small exceptions, was then unenlightened by the discoveries of the present day, the book remains unimpeached and still challenges the test of fair and open examination. Many an American female, no doubt, is now living who might justly acknowledge that she was saved from exposure to the suffering or even the ruin, often the consequences of a convent education, by the disinterested warning given in this book. while its author, disheartened at length by the powerful combination of Protestants and Papists against her, led to distrust even the few who remained her friends, destitute of the means of living, and alternately persecuted and tempted by her ever watchful and insidious enemies, died some years since under condemnation, whether just or unjust, for one of the slightest of the crimes which she had charged against them, thus falling at last their victim. American parents have here a book written for the salvation of their daughters. American patriots, one designed to secure society against one of the most destructive but insidious institutions of popery. American females, an appeal to them of the most solemn kind to beware of convents and all who attempt to inveigle our unsuspecting daughters into them by the secret apparatus of Jesuit schools. The author of this book was a small, slender, uneducated, and persecuted young woman who sought refuge in our country without a protector. But she showed the resolution and boldness of a heroine in confronting her powerful enemies in their stronghold, and proved by the simple force of truth victorious in the violent conflicts which were waged against her by the Romish hierarchy of America and the popular press of the United States. The publishers have thought the present an opportune period to place this work again in the hands of American readers with such information in a preface as is necessary to acquaint readers of the present day with the leading circumstances attending and succeeding its original publication. They have examined most of the evidence supporting the truth of the narrative, of which the public can judge as well as themselves. The details would be voluminous, even of those portions which have been collected since the heat of the controversy which the book long ago excited. Suffice to say that undesigned and collateral evidence in corroboration of it has been increasing to the present day, and that the following brief review of some of the early events will afford a fair specimen of the whole. In the year 1835, Maria Monk was found alone and in a wretched and feeble condition on the outskirts of New York City by a humane man who got her admitted into the hospital at Bellevue. She then first told the story in outline, which she afterwards and uniformly repeated in detail, and which was carefully written down and published in the following form. She said she was a fugitive nun from the Hotel Dieu of Montreal when she had effected her escape in consequence of cruelty which she had suffered and crimes which were there committed by the Romish priest who had the control of the institution, and to which they had access by private as well as public entrances. Having expressed a willingness to go to that city, make public accusations, and point out evidences of their truth in the convent itself, she was taken thither by a resolute man who afterwards suffered for an act of great merit, but she was unable to obtain a fair hearing, apparently through the secret opposition of the priest. She returned to New York, where her story was thought worthy of publication, and it was proposed to have it carefully written down from her lips and published in a small pamphlet. Everything she communicated was, therefore, accurately written down, and when copied out, read to her for correction. But the amount of important material in her possession proved to be far greater than had been supposed, and many pages of notes were accumulated on numerous topics brought up to her attention in the course of conversation and inquiry. All those were submitted to persons fully competent to decide as to the reliability of the evidence, and the strictest and most conscientious care was taken to ascertain the truth. There were but very few Protestants in the United States acquainted with the condition or history of convents in different countries, the characters of those who control and direct them, the motives they have for keeping them secret, the occupations often pursued within their walls, in short, the shameful practices and atrocious crimes of which they have been proved to be the theaters in modern and ancient times by Romish ecclesiastics and even popes themselves. The public were, therefore, quite unprepared to believe such accusations against men professing sanctity of life and a divine commission to the world, although Miss Harrison and Miss Reed of Boston had published startling reports respecting the character of the priests and nuns in that vicinity. The following were some of the considerations which were kept in view by those who proposed the publication of the narrative. If the story is false, it must have been forged by the narrator or some other party. There must have been a motive in either case, and that may be either to obtain notoriety or money, to injure the reputation of the priest accused, or ultimately to remove the unfavorable impressions thrown upon them by their former accusers, by first making charges of atrocious crimes and then disproving them. On the other hand, the story perhaps may be true, and if so, the world ought to know it. In the meantime, here is an unprotected and evidently unfortunate young woman of an interesting appearance who asked to be allowed to make her complaint, voluntarily consenting to submit to punishment if she does not speak the truth. She must be allowed a hearing. It is but justice to say that the investigation was undertaken with strong suspicions of imposture somewhere, and with a fixed resolution to expose it if discovered. As the investigation proceeded, opinions at first fluctuated, sometimes from day to day, but it became evident ere long that if the story had been fabricated, it was not the work of the narrator, as she had not the capacity to invent one so complex and consistent with itself and with many historical facts entirely beyond the limited scope of her knowledge. It was also soon perceived that she could never have been taught it by others, as no part of it was systematically arranged in her mind, and she communicated it in the incidental manner common to uneducated persons who recount past scenes in successive conversations. As she declared from the first that she had been trained to habits of deception in the convent and accustomed to witness deceit and criminality. No confidence could be claimed for her mere unsupported declarations, and therefore a course of thorough cross-questioning was pursued, every effort being made to lead her to contradict herself, but without success. She told the same things over and over again in a natural and consistent manner, when brought back to the same point after intervals of weeks or months. In several instances, it was thought that contradictions had been traced, but when called on to reconcile her statements, she cleared up all doubt by easy and satisfactory explanations. The course pursued by the priests of Canada and their advocates was such as greatly to confirm the opinion that she spoke the truth, and that they were exceedingly afraid of it. The following were some of the contradictory grounds which they at different times assumed in their bitter attacks upon her, her friends, and her books. That she had ever been in the nunnery, that she had been expelled from it, that she had fabricated everything that she published, that several pages from her book, published in the New York Sun, were copied verbatim et literam from a work published in Portugal above 100 years before, entitled The Gates of Hell Opened, that there never was a subterranean passage from the seminary to the nunnery, that there was such a passage in that direction, but that it led to the river St. Lawrence, that the drawings and descriptions of the nunnery, especially of the veiled department, were wholly unlike the reality, but applied to the Magdalen Asylum of Montreal, that several objects described by her were in the nunnery, but not in those parts of it where she had placed them. This was said by a person who admitted that he had been lost amidst the numerous and extensive apartments when he made his observations. That the book was fabricated by certain persons in New York who were named, they being gentlemen of the highest character. That the book was her own production, but written under the instigation of the devil. That the author was a layman and ought to be hung on the first lamppost. That the nunnery was a sacred place and ought not to be profaned by the admission of enemies of the church. After a committee had been appointed to examine the nunnery and report, their demand for admission had been published a year or more. The editor of La Amie du People, A Montreal newspaper devoted to the priest's cause offered to admit persons informally and did admit several Americans who had been strong partisans against the disclosures. Their letter on the subject, though very indefinite, contains several important, though undesigned, admissions strongly corroborating the book. One of the most common charges against the book was that it had been merely for the purpose of obtaining money. Of the falsehood of this, there is decisive evidence. It was intended to secure to the poor and persecuted young female any profits which might arise from the publication, but most of the labor and time devoted to the work were gratuitously bestowed. Besides this, they devoted much time to efforts necessary to guard against the numerous and insidious attempts made by friends of the priest, who by various arts endeavored to produce dissension and delay, as well as to pervert public opinion. The book was published and had an almost unprecedented sale, impressing deep convictions wherever it went by its simple and consistent statements. In Canada especially, it was extensively received as true. But as the American papers were soon enlisted against it, the country was filled with misrepresentations, which it was impossible through those channels to follow with refutations. Her noble sacrifices for the good of others were misunderstood. She withdrew from her few remaining friends and at length died in poverty and prison, a victim of the priest of Rome. Various evidences in favor of its truth afterwards appeared, with which the public have never been generally made acquainted. Some of these were afforded during an interview held in New York, August 17th, 1836, with Monsignor Jones and Leclerc, who had came from Montreal with a work in reply to Awful Disclosures, which was afterwards published. They had offered to confront Maria Monk and prove her an impostor and make her confess it in the presence of her friends. She promptly appeared, and the first explanation of Mr. Jones proved that she was not the person he had supposed her to be. "This is not Fawny Johnson," he said, and he afterwards said, "There must be two Maria Monks." Indeed, several persons were at different times represented to bear that name, and much confusion was caused to the testimony by that artifice. The interview continued about 2 hours, during which the Canadians made a very sorry figure, entirely failing to gain any advantage and exposing their own weaknesses. At the close, an episcopal clergyman from Canada, one of the company, said, "Miss Monk, if I had any doubts of your truth before this interview, they would now have been entirely removed." The book of Mr. Jones was published and consisted of affidavits and such obtained in Canada, including those which had previously been published and which are contained in the appendix to this volume. Many of them were signed by names unknown, or those of low persons of no credit, or devoted to the service of the priest. Evidence was afterwards obtained that Mr. Jones was paid by the Canadian ecclesiastics, of which there had been strong indications. What rendered his defeat highly important was that he was the editor of La Ami du People, the priest newspaper in Montreal, and he was the author of everything which had been written there against Maria Monk, and had collected all the affidavits and testimony. These were his own declarations. An accurate report of the interview was published and had its proper effect, especially his explanation, "This is not Fanny Johnson." The exciting controversy has long passed, but the authentic record of it are imperishable and will ever be regarded as an instructive study. The corruptions and crimes of nunneries and the hypocrisy and chancery of those who control them, with the varied and powerful means at their command, are there displayed to an attentive reader in colors as dark and appalling as other features of the popish system are among us. By the recent exposures of the imputed arrogance of the murderer Bedini and the ambitious and miserly spirit of his particular friend, the Romish Archbishop of New York. Among the recent corroborates of the awful disclosure may be particularly mentioned the two narratives entitled Coralla and the Confessions of a Sister of Charity, contained in the work issued this season by the publishers of the present volume, The Escaped Nun, or Disclosures of Convent Life, and of the authenticity of those two narratives, we can give the public the strongest assurance. After the city of Rome had been taken by siege by the French army in 1849, the priests claimed possession of a female orphan asylum, which had something of the nature of a nunnery. The Republican government had given liberty to all recluses and opened all secret institutions. When will Americans do the same? Subsequently, when the Papists attempted to reinstate the old system, the females remonstrated, barred the doors, and armed themselves with knives and spits from the kitchen. But the French soldiers succeeded in reducing them by force. During the contest, the cry of the women was, "We will not be the wives of the priest." In one of the convents in that city, opened by the Republicans, were found evidence of some of the worst crimes mentioned by Maria Bunk. And in another were multitudes of bones, including those of children. A strong effort will probably be made again by the parties exposed by this book to avoid the condemnation which it throws upon convents, the strongholds of superstition, corruption, and foreign influence in the United States. The Romanish publications, although greatly reduced in number within a few years, will probably pour out much of their unexhausted virulence, as it is their vocation to misrepresent, deny, and vilify. They will be ready to pronounce a general anathema on all who dare to reprint or even to read or believe such strong accusations against the holy retreats of those whom they pretend are devoted to lives of piety. But we will challenge them to do it again by placing some of their iron bishops and even popes in the forefront. In the year 1489, in the reign of Henry VII, Pope Innocent VIII published a bull for the reformation of the monasteries entitled in Latin De Reformationem Monasterium, I can't say that word, in which he says that members of the monasteries and other religious places, both Clemenian, Cistercian, and Praemasters, I can't say that word either, I'm sorry guys, and various other orders in the kingdom of England lead a lascivious and truly dissolute life, and that the Papist reader may receive this declaration with due reverence, we copy the preceding words in Latin as written by an infallible pope, the man whose worshippers address him as vice-regent of God on earth. Of course, his words must convince them, if ours do not. Swine Priory in 1303 had a prioress named Josiana, whose conduct made the name of her house quite appropriate. In France, in the Council of Troyes, AD 999, the Archbishop said, in convents of monks, canons, and nuns, we lay abbots residing with their wives, sons, daughters, soldiers, and dogs. And he charges the whole clergy with being in a deprived and sinful state. But the particulars now before us of such shameful things in Germany, Italy, and such for ages would fill a larger volume than this. Now let the defenders of nunneries repeat, if they dare, their hackneyed denunciation of those who deny their sanctity. Here stand some of their own bishops and popes before us, and the anathemas must fall first upon mitres and tiaras. Americans will know how much confidence to place in the pretended purity of institutions, whose iniquity and shame have thus proclaimed age after age in a far more extensive manner than by this book. But we can at any time shut their mouths by the mere mention of Din's theology, which they must not provoke us to refer to. Wow, I don't even know what to say. So I'm going to pick up here in just a few minutes. Honest to God, I'll be honest with you guys. I just hope my heart can handle it, because they did some really horrible, horrible things. That's all I know. All right, until next time. Oh my goodness. Guys, just seriously, keep your eyes on Jesus and get in the Word of God. Get in the Word of God. Get it in your heart. Know it front, backwards, in, out. Because I tell you what, if we don't, we are going to be deceived. We will. I love you all. Bye-bye.